All right, we're recording.
Excellent. Well, hello. My name is Price Johnston, and I am a professional projection designer, and I also do lighting design and sound design. And I've been working in the industry and projections for about 20 years, or a little over 20 years, actually. So things have changed quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so excited to dig in about that. In fact, I think, Price, we were talking a little bit before the show, and I think what I am really excited about is that this is stuff that I've been teaching on, but it's always so good to get a fresh angle. And I can't wait to hear how some of your experiences, I just kind of want you to reteach me on the things that I think I know.
Right. I hear that.
Well, could we talk a little bit about how you got even started? Maybe even just in general with theater, but then also how did you get into projection design?
Well, how I got started in theater is I went on a high school trip, and I went to the Kennedy Center when I was in ninth grade, and I saw the national tour of Big River. And that is where I just fell in love with lighting right there. And that just opened up so many doors for me. And ever since that point, I was involved in performing arts, in general. And then projections, back in the day before we were able to use video, everyone was using slides on stage. And that's
Right.
where I started, using slides and projectors, large format Pawnee projectors, and learning the kind of intricacies of how to generate that kind of content, which actually has helped me today kind of apply some of those same in the trenches elements to what I do now. We have so many more tools that we didn't have back then. So you had to be very creative with how you generated your content. So
Yeah. Are there some, I know you mentioned Big River, but are there some shows that early on were had a big impact on you? Or, or maybe you could even talk about Big River and like what it was about the lighting design that just sort of drew you in.
Well, I grew up in a family where performing arts and arts in general, whether it be music or dance or theater, were very prevalent. And we would go and see these shows, and we were out of Denver, and we were fortunate to be close to that very large performing arts complex. So we would get some national tours that would go through. And even as a young boy, that's what I kind of latched on to. But it wasn't until later on when I saw Big River when I thought, oh my gosh, I can make a career out of this, or I could go into this for a living. And I think that's a big reality that most people, when they get into performing arts, they have to make that choice. They have to decide whether or not working in the industry and all of the perks, right? There are some great perks, but a lot of that isn't pay, right? So it's harder to sell to the parents initially. So I think the things that I latched onto was the use of color, atmosphere, how the integration of lighting could help with transition elements, and those transition elements from this scene to the next scene and how those things played out really, I think, caused me to say, hey, how is this structured? What are these things? And it kind of propelled me towards learning about, the holistic element of theater, right? And its background. And theater is where I started, but I've also done, corporate events and dance. But I think that background there allows you to break out and work in all these other areas.
Yeah. Are there some shows that you've worked on? I'm sure there are so many, and in some ways they're like our children, right? Where
Exactly.
How do you pick your favorite? Have there been some highlights along the way for you? Maybe some landmark shows that you've worked on that you're just really proud of the work that the team put together?
Oh yeah. Probably an a really interesting show that I worked on was A Joe, and it was presented. The world premiere was at the Happy Days International Beckett Festival in Enniskillen, Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And that show was really crazy because it was produced for television initially. And to work with the Beckett estate, you have to pitch what you're doing. And if you want to change things around, that is a no-no. So I had to come up with a way to pitch my idea of doing this piece for television in a projection art form and have them, the communication had to be there so they could understand what kind of crazy thing we were going to produce. And so this piece involves a television shot with the camera angles. There's very distinct camera moves. It's one take. There's no cuts, no edits, but the camera has to move as it's written within the script. And the actor says no lines that are there. Everything else is done with another actor doing voiceover that is put onto the video, right? And then that's in turn put on television. Well, I wanted to kind of make it a little more interesting and kind of bring it into modern times. So we shot the footage. We got this amazing actress that had some great Beckett background to come in and do all the voiceover work for it. We combined all those elements, and then I wanted to make this unique by projecting televisions on basically trash. So when we showed up in Ireland, where's your set? Where's your surface pieces? Yeah, I'll just go grab some boxes out of some dumpsters and put it together. Wow. And what we did, small scale, in order to let the Beckett estate know that we were being true to the process, that we were being true to the script, was I got those little Kellogg's cereal boxes that you bring when you go camping.
Yeah.
And I wrapped them in white paper, basically, and I took these 4 little boxes and I put them on top of each other and kind of arranged them out. And then I used the Pico projector to kind of arrange all my content, put it into show control, and show them that we would have these 4 blank boxes when people came in, that we would backlight it. It would look like just a pile of nothing. Right. And then all of a sudden the televisions would appear. And as the piece went on, the imagery would move from TV to TV to TV, but the TVs weren't always straight. And sometimes, and at the very end, we would take all of the TVs away, and then the central image of the actor would be projected on those 4 surfaces.
Wow. Wow.
And so it was really unique and fun, but at the same time, it was fingers crossed that we would be able to pull that off, because it was strictly written for television and television only. So we had to maintain that element that, yes, it was television, but at the same time, we were able to kind of bring that kind of projections flair into it. So it was really interesting. And I think Beckett would have really enjoyed something like that, especially if he could have walked in and just seen, what is this bunch of junk that's up there? And then all of a sudden it comes to life. And there's this live theater element to it. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's funny. I think that story is in some ways a perfect setup for what I wanted to ask you about next, because it's such a, tie it together with duct tape kind of a solution that you had to find at the last minute. I know that you do a lot of teaching, and with, probably have a situation where high school teachers, middle school teachers, community theater directors come up to you and say, this projections thing is really cool.
Yeah,
I would love to try it. And I'm sure the next thing that they say is, but man, I'm working with a really challenging space. I'm in a gymatorium, or here's the obstacles, and, spaces can look so many different ways. Are there some things that you find yourself saying, kind of over and over, just kind of general tips or maybe advice about like, how do you get rolling if you're that high school teacher who maybe isn't the most technical person, but wants to start incorporating some projection work into your shows?
Yeah, there's a lot of tips. One of them is the content really matters. So I think what happens is a lot of community, theater or high school teachers get kind of hung up on the hardware component. And yes, that's one point of it, right? One portion of it. If you don't have the projectors, you can't do the show.
Right.
But they think they need these, 25,000 lumen projectors, and
right.
you can really learn if you have really good show control system in place to kind of slug the hardware into place, and then really focus on your content creation. Mm-hmm. So one of the elements that I like to do with a brand new person coming into projections is teach them how to take something that is small scale, like with a Pico projector or with a projector that they're using, right? And do something small scale, not on stage first. So don't learn it initially when you have a live audience and so many things go wrong.
Right.
You need to play a little bit. So I try to get them really comfortable with the tools and then really comfortable making content, and then take those two elements, right, and take their oftentimes leftover secondhand business projectors and figure out how can they use these to get the number of lumens that they want on what type of surface from what angle, and then see if they can have the right technology in place, whether it be just something simple like a laptop with QLab on it, or other show control systems, but something that's easy to learn, right? Mm-hmm. Which is always a challenge for some of them because they don't even have that kind of technology. They can get their hands on something that would run it.
Right.
So I always try to get them to start small, without an audience, figure out how everything works, then generate the content, then figure out how that whole hardware component comes into place, because everyone gets hung up on hardware first, but they don't get a chance to kind of play and see what's out there, right? Yeah. And then they try to just throw it up on stage, and that's usually where it runs into problems, I think.
Yeah.
So try to implement with live audience right away.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's get hung up on hardware for just a second.
Sure.
Because I know lumens, for example, which we know is brightness, when it comes to projectors, but that would have been kind of a dirty word to mention like 5 years ago, or, especially 10 years ago in a high school or community theater environment. But now, as technology has evolved, it's more common.
Yeah, absolutely. It's even on a light bulb packaging now.
Right.
So if you go get a standard A lamp for your house or whatever, it'll tell you how many lumens are there and a color temperature, right?
Right. So what for you, and I know no space is made alike, and there's so many variables that go into this, but when a teacher or director is saying, how many lumens do I need to do this? I know, right? What do you give a general or kind of a baseline recommendation, Price?
Yeah, that's a very tough question because it matters. There are many factors that come into play, right? Are they front projecting? And if they are front projecting, are these projections going to hit the actors? Mm-hmm. And if they are, then how many lumens do you want, right, to kind of burn through? And are there ways that you can get the projections off the actors? Mm-hmm. And so there's this kind of tug of war that's going to happen there. If they're rear projecting, what is their screen like? What are you using, right? Is it standard RP? If it's a darker gray, then you're going to need a little more lumens to push through. So I would say to somebody initially as they start, I would say, don't even attempt it at unless you have 5,000 lumens. Mm-hmm. But that's doable because it's two business projectors, this junkers stacked on top of each other, right? So you can do that. ideally you want as many lumens as you can get, right?
Right.
And then you need to learn how to manipulate your content or do that in show control and bring your lumens down so you don't, burn people's retinas because you have so you have to learn that through a process. And it's hard when you initially are just coming right into it, right? Like, what do I do? Like, how do I make this look good? Or how do I bring this contrast, into play?
Right.
So that's a tough question to answer all in one go, but I would say don't even attempt anything without about 5,000 lumens. I think you kind of need that to burn through stage lights a little bit, regardless of where you're coming from. But I think your goal is to shoot, ideally, if you're just doing a nice big production run, 12,000 lumens is a great baseline, and you can go from that. And this is professionally, right? So some of the shows that I've worked on, some of the larger shows, we've had 25,000 lumens plus. It just depends on what you're doing, right? Right. Or whether or not you're rear projecting or front projecting or whatnot.
Yeah. Well, and the question that kind of follows up with that, because let's picture that it's a teacher that maybe it's like an island that they're on, basically, where they are kind of the go-to person. They have to figure out a lot. Maybe they don't have a lot of tech support, and they're poking around on Amazon or they're poking around on eBay, and they're trying to navigate those to figure out what kind of a projector that they even want to buy. Let's say that they're maybe they're taking that next step of, okay, I've tried the classroom projectors. Now we're going to go digital enough that I know I want to purchase something.
Yeah.
What would be some ways you would boil that down? Because of course you look at all the specs on Amazon and it can become pretty overwhelming when you're trying to compare one projector to another. Are there things in your experience, it doesn't have to be specific brands, but like, what should they be looking for? What are some of the key things to kind of pay attention to when they're shopping?
Well, I feel a little bit like people get hung up on resolution right now because it's such a big thing when it comes to talking about televisions.
Mm-hmm.
The media you might have in your house, 4K this and that kind of thing. And at 30 feet, that resolution begins to, change a bit. So you see people go towards projectors where they have these really high resolutions, and maybe that's not the first route that you should go, right? Is try to get these amazing pixel perfect things that are, that are super pricey. So sometimes what you really are looking for is a nice high contrast ratio, right? Mm-hmm. And something that's going to deal very well with, video gray or getting a nice black level on stage, because a blackout really matters within the performing arts, right? And so if you've got, whether it be a dance piece or a theater piece or opera or whatnot, when you go dark, you don't want to see this great video gray rectangle up on stage, especially if you're front projecting. So you got to find a projector, I think, that plays to those specs a little bit better. So where you're trying to keep things good and dark when there's no content up, right? And that resolution, generating your content with all the 4K or whatnot, I'm trying to run all this video on top of each other, it begins to bog down your system. And if you don't have a very good computer or multiple computers running these things, you're gonna run into huge problems, especially if you have videos stacked on top of each other, you start throwing in effects and whatnot. It could be really a challenge. So when I say selecting a projector, I think you find one with a good native resolution that will play well, for your space, but don't go overboard. That's where you run into issues. And some of the newer technology is pretty amazing. Some of the laser technology that's out there is awesome, but you'll see that the price of those go exponentially up, right? When you kind of spot, pricing those things out. So you got to be careful on what type of projector you're choosing. But now they're getting so the regular projectors are standard DLP or whatnot. They're getting cheaper and cheaper. So it's not out of the bounds that a high school can come up with a full stage projection surface, which is awesome, right? Something unheard of, 5 years ago, and now it's something they can bring in at that level. So we had a high school out here that did a production of Big Fish, and they were able to take their projector, which I think is about 12,000 lumens, and just do a full surface on the cyc, and then they projected multiple elements on it, and did a wonderful job, right? And that's what they needed, and they shot that all the way from the rear of the house, and then up on the stage. So if you have the right lens system and you have a pretty good projector, you can pull off wonders. But it's not out of the reach of high schools to come up with that money and that element when buying a projector. So I think you just got to watch out for the resolution element. There, everybody gets so hung up on that.
Yeah. So getting like a 1280 by 720.
Yeah.
Just fine.
Just fine. And that's a great place to start. I can't tell you, I would say probably the majority of my content that I generated, especially, early on, was 1280 by 720, like just getting that widescreen format into place. And that content is still usable, right? So
Yeah. And one of the things, and you probably remember a little bit when I was doing the class that we talked about, is in addition to just the stage distance, you also have that idea that it in a lot of cases, especially for more scenic projection, truly is a background. So having it be pixel sharp is not even necessarily something that you might want, because really the sharpest thing should be the actors.
Right.
And what's behind it can fall back a little bit, almost like some nice camera depth of field where you've got, something that's slightly more impressionistic, so that there's some true separation between the actor and the background.
And I think that plays out very well when you blur the background out, or you shift it and you add some of those effects into your background imagery. People are used to going to see movies, right? So they're used to the framing.
Right.
So with that in place, it's okay. Like, they're used to seeing this depth of field, and building that into the projections is awesome. I think that really works well. And you're right. You can get away with that. It doesn't have to be this picture perfect thing all the time.
Yeah, totally. Very rarely, like you were saying, is anybody have their nose up on the screen, examining the pixels. And if they are, you've got a problem.
Yeah. And I think some people also, when they generate content for the first time, they choose photorealism as their what they're going to go for. And do not start there. Don't start on super hard to pull off with the content, right? Start with something that you can work with, impressionistic or whatnot, right?
Right.
It's something that you can actually generate with speed as well, right? Because speed is a factor, especially if you're making content. Now, if you're not making content, speed in which you can program or make edits, that kind of thing, is also a factor. So.
Well, that's a perfect bridge into the software end of it, which I know that even in the class that you taught recently, you were really demonstrating that, there is no one answer, both from a production standpoint and from an educational standpoint, that you can, it's good. The software is evolving and changing so fast that you don't want to put too much focus on it. I mean, you need to know the tool to be able to do the job, but what are some recommendations that you have? And maybe going back to that high school teacher who maybe they're not learning it themselves, but they're delegating students. So the students, it's good for the students to learn it for the sake of knowing some software to be able to make things. But then also to make the show happen, what are some recommendations you have for software to start out with?
Well, from a show control perspective, there is not one answer. Mm-hmm. There are many different strengths and weaknesses that all of these different show control types have. So price is one big issue, I think, early on.
Yeah.
Especially for a high school or community theater that's just getting into it. Right? Some of those projection show controls can get very pricey. And if I'm reaching for something initially just to teach, I'm going to reach for something that I know they can learn within, say, an hour session and be able to at least put surfaces into place, make cues fade in and out, right? Make them crossfade with one another, stack content on top of each other, save the show, of course.
Yeah.
And, work within the bounds of their system. So I think initially, I don't know if you're looking for manufacturers' names or things like that. Is that what you're?
I mean, obviously we're not endorsing anything, but I mean,
I'm not endorsing any of these, but there are many that you could reach for. So I think QLab 4 Pro Video is a great entry level and perfect starter. You can pull off amazing things with it.
Yeah.
And even though it doesn't have the same functionality as, say, something like Isadora, which is also an amazing piece of software, what it does have is that speed factor, and it does have a price point that you can get involved with it. And it's not to say that you can't compete and make great shows with it, because you certainly can. Isadora allows you to really do a lot of artistic changes with your content that you have, but it's got a larger learning curve as far as initial programming. But once you have it down, then you kind of understand it, and some people really like it. So I know people that have kind of an audio mind, and they love Isadora because it looks like when they're plugging stuff in, it looks like, a signal flow diagram. So they're, I got to plug this into that, and that into that, and that. And so it really makes sense to them. I was showcasing Resolume off recently when I was teaching at a festival. And Resolume is used by clubs and big nightclubs, and also for music events, concerts, that kind of thing. And so it's kind of a DJ software, but its application can absolutely be used on stage.
Right.
But it allows for a lot of live mixing and interactive elements that you could put into place. It has some great mapping and masking features that are there. I think Mad Mapper is a great way to get into some mapping. And then you can kind of raise the bar from there and start getting into hippos and the watch out and so on and so forth. But when you start doing that and getting into the realm of media servers and go beyond the realm of software and hardware, right, it begins to skyrocket a bit, and that pricing can go way up. So entry level, I think you start with some of those programs before you get those others, right?
Yeah. Well, sticking to the technical, let's talk about screens or projection surfaces for a minute, because anything can be a surface to project onto. A wall, sheets, frosted shower curtains, there's a whole list. Boxes, found objects, flat or not flat. There's all sorts of options. Let's say that a school or community theater, though, is going to try to maybe go more digital altogether with just some of their solutions for creating scenic environments, with projection stuff. Where would you start them out? Kind of on the, I don't want to say $0, but close to $0 area. And then what would be your recommendations for, like, maybe a way that they could continue to level up towards something that's going to be a better surface for projection for them?
Right. So as far as starting out with surfaces, wow, that's a tough one. Most high school theaters have some sort of drop that you can start with, right? So whether that be some muslin drop or a cyc that they've got, maybe they're lucky enough to have a shark tooth, some scrim elements as well. And I think if you start initially with getting your system in place, the surfaces, yes, they do matter. And if you choose the wrong surfaces, or if you're trying to use found surfaces, you can run into problems where you have generated too much contrast. Maybe it's too dark, and then you're shooting your content on it and it's not really hard to see, right?
Yeah.
So I think where I have started that is super cheap is to go with construction plastic, because you can get it in rolls. It's nice and big. You can shred it up and make crazy stuff with it.
Yeah.
So for example, there was a production that I was working on of Polaroid stories, and we just wanted to feel like this kind of broken down, forgotten lot, and that there was a piece of scaffolding and then some plastic that had blown off the side of a building or whatnot. And then I shredded that and then put it up there and used it as a surface. And if you get some of that thicker mill plastic, it's a great way to start getting some surfaces in place from nothing. Like, it's super cheap, and you can find it at any of your home improvement warehouses. So I think that's a great place to start. I think you run into some problems with, I love using sheets, especially if you front project. When you rear project and try to put those projectors back there and you don't have them rigged in the air and you have them down on the ground or on a table behind, you're going to see that lens blend through that. And that's harder to deal with, within the house. So you got to really think about where, not only what that surface is, but where you're going to put that projector, right? How is that projector going to interact with the surface? So starting out cheap, those are great ways to go. There are paints that you can get that are designed to take projections, so you can throw those paints in place. But standard paint works too. Not knocking on the projection paints, but it does. It just depends on what you're going for. And then you also have to think about, with surfaces, is if projections has live actors or performers in front of it or behind it, right? Or they're in front of the projections, right? How much bounce is coming off that stage light? And with that stage light that's there, you have to kind of also learn to play with those surfaces in a different way when you're talking lighting.
Yeah.
So you can't just approach the production as you always approach every production in the past, where you're like, oh yeah, well, we use this in Oklahoma, it's going to work, but now we're adding projections. Yeah, great. Right. But now you might need to think about, can we change up where these actors are blocked? Can we change how we actually light this? Can we light them from the sides more? What can I do to keep light off of the surface?
Right.
So the surface choice, initially, yes, you can find some cheaper alternatives, but you also have to think about changing your mentality about how you're going to approach this thing. And that may mean that you can't use the same systems lighting-wise that you had used before. And you need to evolve that thinking a little.
Right.
So I think surfaces is one factor. Is yes, you can find some cheaper approaches to get into, but you also have to think about the change in mentality of the rest of your whole show package, right?
Right. And then, of course, when you do take that next step, obviously when you want to spend money, there's all sorts of options. Rose Brand and all these companies are there to sell you fabrics and different things that are really specific to taking a projected image and all of that.
Right.
Would you say that that's something that's doable for a high school to call up Rose Brand and, get some kind of fabric? Is that within their general price range, or would you wait a few shows, or what would be your kind of general recommendation about that?
I wouldn't do it initially, because I would find out whether or not you think your hardware can handle that, because that's quite a big investment usually. Rose Brand does have some surface material that is not as pricey, and you can get into that. But if you start with something that's really workable and cheap, then you can figure out whether or not, oh, wow, what we really need to do is upgrade the projectors, or the show control we used didn't work for what we really needed to do, so we need to try different software to get that to happen. But I think it's totally workable, and there are many high schools that have that much funding that they can go right into it, you know.
What are some good tips for, I mean, you mentioned keeping light off of the surface, right? And I mean, once again, there's so many different scenarios depending on what kind of a lighting system you're working with and the flexibility. Are there some good general tips that you have in terms of how do you get that darkest well, keeping some of those stage lights off of the screen? Is it just getting up on a ladder and tilting them? Or like, what are some recommendations that you would make?
Let me use a great example. So one of the shows that I worked on, this off-Broadway production, it was a wedge, a white-walled wedge that had these doors in it that could open and close, and it had slip stages that came in and out.
Mm-hmm.
And the wedge that was in place was projected on, right? And it also had a ceiling on it as well.
Mm.
So we could project on the ceiling and in the middle of this wedge.
Wow.
But the floor was black, but it was glossy black, right? So what I think people need to do, especially if it's a high school or community theater and they've got this kind of standard rep plot that they're using all the time or whatnot, is you really need to think about not only how can I, shutter cut or point these lights off of the surface, but at the same time, what kind of bounce are you going to get off your stage floor? And I think an approach towards learning to use projections is also that surface, which doesn't sometimes get projections, like you might not be projecting on the floor, really does matter. So if it's a nice glossy, or if it's, a cafetorium that's got this great glossy, wood floor,
yeah,
that's a challenge. You throw a stage light on it, you can't control it.
Right.
And that's about changing your angles and making sure that you're coming in from the sides and you're bouncing that light off into the wings where they can't be seen. So you have to really think about that surface before you fix those other problems, which could occur.
Right.
But yeah, there's the approach usually for me is to light things more from the side, or even light something like you would light a dance.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't bring the action further forward and away from the screen, right?
Right.
Or you could rear project, right? And then you still have the problem if you have people standing right next to the screen, how are you going to keep the light off of them, right? So you got to definitely come up with that solution prior to having like tech week.
Yeah, right.
That's the solution. That's not the solution. Like, you have to do it well in advance, and it needs to be part of the conversation from the get-go. Yeah.
That's a great.
We have these great services, but we also need to figure out how are we going to control the lighting around them, and how close are the performers going to be to those services.
Well, I think that is a great point too. Just, it's even less about the technical piece, but just the mentality when especially if you know up front that you really want to use projections, really considering that from the get-go as a fabric or an integral piece of your scenic design. I was working with a high school director, and she knew for her production of Elf, the musical, that she really wanted vibrant colors. She really wanted the projections to really sing in a lot of the scenes. And so she really structured her scenic design around that, and even considered her staging and other things, in a complementary process. So it made it so much easier on her when it got toward Tech Week, as opposed to, oh yeah, we were going to put projections in this thing, and you turn on all your lights and all of a sudden everything's getting washed out and you can't, they're not working.
Yeah. And I think probably the best advice I could give to, a high school or community theater as they're just getting into this is Tech Week will take twice as long when you add video for the first time. It will. So you need to double that tech time out, because there are many factors that you just are not paying attention to that are going to creep up, right? One of them could be, we're projecting. Great, awesome, but you're using that same space as a crossover. So here comes all these actors running through your projections, and now you don't want that to happen. So how
Yeah.
you do that, right? So these little things like that will creep up, and then you're like, oh, I have to reblock this. I have to move these performers around.
Yeah.
Dancers can't come in from in 3; they have to come in from in 1 on the other side of the stage. So you have to um, think about that ahead of time. You know,
Which could seem, I mean, it can seem on one hand like a big obstacle, but if you know, even delegate that to some of your students, like a project throughout the entire production, it's a
yeah.
real opportunity. I mean, like another example, I was working with a group and they were doing Pride and Prejudice, and they had 2 large Victorian windows, and they were running simultaneous projections, but they weren't running them from one computer. They had 2 kids on 2 separate
Oh
laptops
yeah.
sitting behind the screen, both of them with headphones, and I think they were running Google Chat, and they rehearsed that thing just like you would rehearse a dance. So
Yeah.
while everything else was happening in the normal flow of a rehearsal, they were going 3, 2, 1 and mastering the craft of, because obviously you don't want one Victorian window to show an image and then the other. So they really had to be
Right.
spot on in sync. And I think it just kind of in some ways can really unlock creativity,
Oh yeah.
and gives the kids another opportunity, maybe who maybe wouldn't even be involved in more traditional tech, but gives them an opportunity to exercise their video skills or their playback skills or things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That just reminds me of a show also that I saw that high school did, where they just used Windows and they just backed it with butcher paper,
Mm-hmm.
white butcher paper, and then they projected onto it. But that's that you need a cheap surface. That's a great cheap surface. And
Yeah,
so,
there you go.
but it and it also brings up the point that yeah, you can, if you know what you're doing when you're building your content, and you know what you're doing when you learn how to basically do a set trace or mask things out, then you can run things off of Keynote. And
Yeah,
that means that if you need to have multiple ops, you can pull that off. It doesn't matter that you don't
right.
have the perfect show control system. That just speeds you up and makes things run really smooth. But you could still use a presentation format, PowerPoint, Keynote, whatnot, to kind of push that stuff and go. And I love those kind of solutions. So seeing a
Yeah,
solution like that with the 2 ops, hey, I mean, it worked, right?
yeah, yeah.
They pulled it off.
It looks beautiful.
There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. And if people don't see the man behind the curtain, they don't see Oz, but they see Oz on stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what matters, right? So don't get too hung up on the whole cost factor, I think.
Yeah, and you know, and this is maybe more on the content end, but it was really neat too, seeing how bringing that new technology into a more classic story, you know, can bring in some ways a new life to it too. It's not even necessarily about the technology, but it's about the use of that technology. And as you know, with things like Photoshop and After Effects and some of the filters that you can get a hold of, you can give things a nostalgic look. You can give things the look of Technicolor from the 1940s. You can make it look like daguerreotype type photos. I mean, there's so many options on the content, and especially for just telling stories, maybe that have been told time and time and time again in a certain way, being able to tell them in a fresh way,
Right.
using some of these new tools.
Yeah. Yeah. I think getting into learning an Adobe suite, and most people have access to it some way, shape, or form. They may not know they do, but they might have access to at least learning that. And of course, tutorials on YouTube, and there's so many ways to kind of learn those elements. But getting
Right.
a video editor in place, learn Photoshop, and you can start generating content that you're really proud of, and find ways to get it up on stage, right?
Yeah. Well,
It's
another,
accessible now, where back in the day it wasn't accessible, right?
yeah,
And it's super expensive, or there was no way to learn it. You had to read books, or if you were lucky, you could go take some sort of training session.
right.
Now it's as close as Google, right?
Yeah.
So you can find a way. If you don't know how to make a flickering neon sign,
Mm-hmm.
you can punch up on YouTube neon sign, After Effects, and someone will show you how to make a neon sign, and then you can take those lessons learned there and apply it to your content. So there's this instant master's class that's available to you
Right.
4 hours a day, right? So,
Which is so exciting. I mean, you and I are both old enough that we, like you're saying, you remember the days where you had to seek out maybe the one book in the library
right.
that had anything to say at all about it. But now, and I'm kind of that way. I'm a kind of a project learner as opposed to a tutorial manual learner. So,
Right.
you know, I still remember when I was in college and 3D was first coming in, and I got invited down to the Softimage lab and went down there, and they only had 3 machines because each of them were like $12,000 a seat. And to get started on this thing, you had a series of books that you had to go through. And boy, I was so refreshed when the moment came where I could stop following the books and I could just work on a project,
Right.
and start learning that way. And like you're saying, YouTube is so great because you can set out with a project mission or a scene that you want to accomplish, and you get stuck, you just jump over to YouTube, you take a tutorial, and you know, there you go.
Yeah. That was my point a little bit about jumping in without your first experience being on stage, right? Just try to do something artistic first.
Yeah.
And that's available to you now to learn. Whereas, back in the day, it was all about who do I know that I could call on my house phone, which for people who don't know what that is, it's a phone attached to your house. You actually would have to have this cord and then talk on it. No, but you would have to be like, who can I call to tell me how to do this edit thing? And now it's just so much easier to get to, and that content is there. But if you learn it by doing, right, and then you add the audience by learning and doing, then you get better and better each and every time. And if you run into somebody that tells you that they know everything, then they don't. I'll tell you that. It's just things are changing, and you learn every single production. I learn something new, or I learn a new type of software that I never knew before, and that's awesome, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the industry in general. Is there is always something changing, and you can come up with these great creative tools, and who knows, 2 years from now you won't even touch that tool again, but it does plant the seed for something else that's coming down the pipe, and you get to kind of just really stretch your creative brain.
Yeah, I love that. I've only got one more question for you.
Sure.
Because especially as I visited states like Texas, and they have the one axe competition, and so for them, doing projections is not something where they can focus on a projector and dead hang, where they can just mount the thing and it's okay. They're really thinking about, how do I have something that's much more mobile? And once I get to the location that I'm going to be projecting in, where do I put this projector? What are some ideas about where to hide it or where to put it, or how to create, my setup in a way where I really can set this thing up in 7 minutes, since I've got some constraints that I'm working with. Do you have any recommendations for people who maybe aren't looking at just having one installed in their space, but it's almost like a show on the road for them?
Sure. One of the high schools in this region that I'm at recently did a show where they had some old classroom projectors that were short throw projectors, and they mounted them onto a wagon with wheels, and so they could move them around. So they rear projected onto a surface, then it was mounted on the wagon. And so, loading something like that in is, let's load in the wagon, let's put the surface up, you're ready to go. They just plug it in, and then they had a tether off of the back that went to their laptop that they were running everything from. And I think sometimes that could be a solution, is you integrate the projector into your scenic pieces that are there. Another one is, if you can't hard mount it onto an electric, or if you can't hard mount it onto a boom or whatnot, is how can you utilize rear rear projection in a great way, because you can always put a projector on the floor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a good show control system, or even one of those that I mentioned earlier, right? They can help you invert your content. They can help you deal with keystoning. They can change the surface really quickly. If it's already programmed when you're there, you just change your surface around and then your content is ready to go. And
Yeah.
you can do that. So rear projection is always a great way to go. It's when you start front projecting in a festival situation that you're going to run into more problems, because then it's kind of like, well, I can't put it up there. Can I put it in the house? Can I put it on the front of the stage? And if you do that, then you have performers in front of that, all those things. So I think integrating the projections into the scenery, or putting the projections into a rear projection type format, makes it nice and easy for you to get in and out with your content and manipulate it for that tour situation, right? And then go from there. I would also say that don't rely necessarily on house material that's there. If a theater says, yeah, we have this projector and you can use it, it's better to roll with something that you know.
Yeah.
Right? The devil you know, rather than because you get there and then all of a sudden all of your converters, because you're using some triple head system or something, and everything's coming out in HDMI, but the projector that they have is a VGA. And then
Right.
you're like, oh no,
Right.
you're running into problems. So if you can tour with an enclosed system that you know and you control, that makes it so much easier.
Yeah.
On anything that a house supplies. Not that houses don't supply you with some great stuff. There are plenty of that, but it's a time element, right?
Yeah.
So you want to come in with a system that you know works, and then use it. So yeah, I would say those approaches are probably the best.
Well, Price, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. It's great being here.